Hello, everyone. We're excited to have Behan and Jamie Gifford from Sailing Totem back with us today for another great Salty Dog webinar. Today, they'll be presenting Route Planning Strategies, a Cruiser's Perspective. I'm going to ask everyone to keep video off and to keep muted. And if you have questions during the webinar, go ahead and type them into the chat box that I've opened. And now I'll hand things over to our Salty Dog Education Coordinator, Alex Helfand.
Thanks, Barb, and welcome everyone. So today's talk kind of fits along sort of the theme of this series, which was around providing additional, skills and techniques that you can use to get through your passages. And today we're going to be, Jamie and Behan are going to be talking about route planning and considerations and ways of making your trip a lot more efficient and comfortable. And I will say very little more than that and turn it over to them.
Hey, thanks, Alex. Thanks, Barbara. We're happy to be here. For folks who have joined us for past presentations we've done for Salty Dog Sailing Association, you'll notice the background here is a little different. We are not, in fact, on Totem, which is both sad and good, because right now Totem is somewhat torn apart in the shipyard here in Puerto Penasco, Mexico, all in a good way. But we also have air conditioning here, and at the moment we're very, very grateful for the air conditioning.
And much less dust.
Yeah, we it's been heat index of pushing 100 lately, and you couple that with grinding fiberglass, and it's really, really great to have a place to retreat to, which is clean and cool.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk about route planning today. Let me get the slide started up here. Just a second. And as we go along here, we want to encourage you, especially because we've got a more intimate class here. Please ask questions. We've got plenty of content for the duration of the program, but frankly, we can tailor and adjust things. And when there's a smaller group, especially, we can really dig into some of the questions that you've got. So I want you to feel welcomed to do that. That you don't have to wait until the end. If there's stuff we'll cover later, we'll let you know.
And one side note: I'm between cataract surgeries.
Yeah.
My left eye is newly bionic. My right eye is the old version still. And so if it takes me a moment of hesitation to see something.
If he does the pirate thing,
yeah,
looking at a slide, you'll know why.
I'm not having a seizure. It's okay. All right. So route planning. Let's jump into this.
All right. Little backgrounder for folks that haven't met us before. Jamie and I started sailing. Wow, together.
Before cataract surgery.
That's right. We started sailing together actually in 1989. Well, 89 was the first race that we did on a J35 in Fisher's Island Sound. And at the time, Jamie was racing on some much fancier boats than the Sunfish that I grew up learning how to sail on. They were the boats that you actually see here. But we took our relative and very, very different levels of experience and put them together, and it turned it into this marvelous family adventure to trace that red line that you see around the world with our family. Up at the left there, our three kids, Niall, Marin, and Siobhan, who've grown up aboard Totem. And we're really grateful for the opportunity to be here to share our experience, our enthusiasm, to help folks who are thinking about their own big picture or local picture route planning, and try to make that not just a less intimidating process, but truly, I think part of the byline for the program was that to have passage making be comfortable and safe, so that it's something that your whole family can enjoy.
Okay. So what is route planning? What is passage planning? What are passage planning strategies? Next slide. Let's make sure we're all talking the same language here to begin with. So maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was a cruising boat, catamaran, that left from Moorea in French Polynesia. And they were going to Huahine, which is about a 90-mile passage. And we had done this passage, the same exact route, in 2010. And we went through some of the things, or probably all the things that we're going to go through today in the class. And unfortunately, this particular passage didn't go well. And I don't call it out for anything against the family, but there were some mistakes made. Next slide.
It's worth learning from.
It's
without finger pointing, honestly, because
truly not.
They are the kind of things that happen over and over again, and these are things compounded in a situation that makes it a good lesson.
So the story goes effectively that it was a 90-mile passage, and they did, based on their boat's typical speed, that they were going to leave in the morning and get there probably just before sunset, which means a pretty high average rate of speed. And what happened is the first challenge was they fell behind their projected timing. And as they approached the island, it had gotten dark already, and the conditions were a little bit rougher than they expected. And what they did is they rounded the island thinking that if they tuck in behind the island, they can get out of the sea state. But I think anybody that spent time cruising in the South Pacific knows, or around any atolls, tropical islands, that there's always a fringing reef around it. And somehow this detail they didn't know, and they relied on their charts. But the charts gave them, at least to their mind, conflicting information. And so they rounded the island quite tight. And instead of doing this green track, which is the safe path around to where the entry is, they rounded really tight and ended up sailing into this charted reef. You can see quite clearly on Google Earth here. And so I think it just comes down to missing some steps, and it unfortunately, next slide, ended up quite badly for the boat. The family was all fine. And I've made a million mistakes myself. I'm happy to talk about those and how I've learned along the way. So it's not about that, but it's trying to give information to help other people not have kinds of traumatic experiences like this. Next one. So the goal here is safely and efficiently getting to your destination. And your destination may not end up being the planned destination. It may be a bailout point, which is an important part of route planning. But the point is safely and efficiently. The less time we can spend out there means there's less exposure to weather and less potential for mechanical failure, fatigue, and other issues that can.
And because things change. Weather systems do things that they weren't expected to do. Things creep up.
And it's blocked here in the Zoom menus, but I think I say pilot in there. Yes, to pilot to a destination. Next slide. And I use the word pilot specifically because I think it's an important distinction here. So navigating is knowing your position, and piloting is positioning to not hit anything, to hit nothing. And that's really important because one of the things that we try not to do is, unfortunately, this mistake here, it was a navigator's human error mistake where he didn't zoom in on the chart. This is in the Vendée Globe Challenge a few cycles ago, ended up hitting this very charted reef at about 20 knots. No injuries, fortunately. And so a big part of route planning and strategy is setting yourself up to not come in contact with anything. It sounds simple and overly simple, really, but it's not. There's more to it. All right, so with this, we're going to start with what we call big picture routing. There's 3 different categories: big picture routing, pre-passage planning, and then routing underway. And so we start with the big picture routing. What this has to do with is looking at the variables that define a season of routing. We're zoomed out now to, okay, where it's coming into hurricane season and we're in USVIs, and the goal is to get to Grenada by the time hurricanes get bubbly. Okay, that's the season. Or you're from Florida, and you're going north through the season. But what are these considerations around weather? Weather is this huge driving variable that kind of bookend the season that we have for cruising. So next one. With hurricane season, each region of the ocean, subtropical and tropical region of the ocean, it's a different season. And so if you're on this big track to cross oceans or maybe do a circumnavigation, you kind of want to zoom really far out and look at what those different seasons are so you can start to plan. A lot of people we work with come to us with this idea of going from A to B to C on this kind of even linear projection of time. and it doesn't take into account the varying hurricane seasons that happen differing in the northern and southern hemispheres. There's a little bit more to it when you're looking at big picture routing. Hurricane season in the North Atlantic is what, May 15th to November 30th, and that's a big time of the calendar year to want to just be holed up in a place. And so when we were in that part of the world, what we did was we studied the incidence of hurricane and frequency and when they started to really get active. And what we found is through the historicals is that it was not until early August did they really become more frequent and grow in size. And so to us, we felt like if we had time and mobility, we could still be active in an area with the idea that we could see it pretty far off and then get to a place where the hurricane wasn't going to be. So really know what that hurricane season is. Do a little bit more research than just saying May to November. Okay, but there's more to the seasons that define our big picture routing than just hurricane season. When the Salty Dog Rally leaves in November from Norfolk, it's the end of hurricane season. There's actually a 3 or 4 weeks to the real end of hurricane season, according to NOAA, but it's also the beginning of gale season. And gale season is pretty much as unfun if you're out there in the wrong conditions as hurricane season. So you're in this tightrope between these two different seasons that have pretty devastating weather. So you have to kind of plan that well. Lightning season in Florida in the summer, and Panama and Costa Rica, in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, big areas of lightning that can have pretty financially devastating effects for boats that end up there and maybe don't realize how much lightning there is.
It's true, and I want to call that out in particular because we have a more North American audience here, that people look at Panama, I think, as sometimes a safe place to go for hurricane season. And it's because of that fact that hurricanes don't track to Panama, which is great until you realize the high incidence of lightning that overlaps with hurricane season there. Having known numerous boats, I mean, I feel like we know a couple every year in Panama that are hit by lightning and lose their electronics, which is generally a $50,000+ proposition when you deal with the full ramifications of a direct strike. That's a really big deal, not just financially, but in terms of the setback in time that it takes to reset and get back onto whatever the big picture plan was intended to be in the first place.
It's also really intimidating to be in a lightning storm. We've been in a number of them, and it's just it's never fun.
No.
Cold season. So a lot of people that we've worked with come from Canada or the high latitudes, and they're like, "Oh, I don't mind if I'm not, if I'm late and I'm coming down in November or December."
Right. That used to be us. High latitude cruising sounds great.
Not really getting that there's a difference between going from your house to your car and having heat in all those places to being on a boat that doesn't keep the cold out so well. So just being aware that on the water, 20 knots of wind, 50 miles an hour or 50 degrees may not sound that cold, but with the wind chill and water and a boisterous sea state, it's a whole lot colder than it may seem like on paper. Mm-hmm. And monsoon season, these are seasonal reversing winds. You're going to the Western Pacific in through the Indian Ocean. There's a lot of monsoonal winds there, and if you get it wrong, it means you're not going with the trade winds, you're going into the monsoonal trade winds at that time of year, and it's pretty uncomfortable doing that. So you want to know what are the wind patterns like into the places that you're going. Okay, next slide. So another big picture routing consideration are security. Are there any security issues on the path that you're kind of plotting out based on hurricane season and lightning season, those variables?
So what Jamie's got is a screenshot here is going from Borneo on the left side, on the right side, over to the Malay Peninsula on the left, and there's Singapore at the tip of it. And we left from one of the Malaysian states in Borneo, Sarawak there, near the red arrow, from Kuching, and crossed this portion of the South China Sea, which is well known to have a high incidence of piracy. In fact, this area has more piracy than what you probably think of as the pirate-ridden waters of the world, whether it's off of the Horn of Africa or Venezuela, quite a bit more. but they don't go after private boats. And that was the major consideration here. For us to take the route, which actually isn't too different from that red line through what are known pirate-ridden waters, because there was no record of boats like ours, private cruising boats, being targeted, we were very comfortable making that decision. We heard plenty about commercial vessels. There's certainly nothing to take lightly, but we didn't feel that it was going to be an issue for us. Oh, sorry. And in fact, it wasn't actually. This is as we were leaving Borneo. We were scouted about halfway across near the Anambas Islands by vessels for a mothership, and they were highly identifiable to us because they were so distinct from fishing boats in terms of their communications capacity, their lack of flags or colorful painting or names or anything, that really big VHF antenna, and the fact that they had fast, powerful outboards.
But they had no interest in us ultimately.
No. We waved, they waved, they carried
on. Another area of piracy is in the Indian Ocean, and when we were looking to go in 2015, you can see in the bottom right the differences in instances of piracy, whether they were successful or otherwise, versus just 5 years before. And so even though there's this piracy box that was drawn, and it was still there when we did this trip, we felt the risk was virtually zero.
And there were more dynamics at play, and that's part of what's important here. Understanding the underlying dynamics for security. Okay, they're down. Why are they down? What are the factors that are driving piracy in this region that have made that happen, so that we can be aware if one of those factors changes? For example, war in Somalia actually being a driving factor here, as well as seasonality in the time of year. But so important to pay attention, because in this area, yes, boats like ours were being targeted. And in fact, we have known boats that were attacked and where the crew were either held ransom, or in one case, they were tragically killed, which is coming up here.
Yeah, and that's the case with this boat. There were 4 Americans on it, and they were taken captive, and then tragically they were killed. And the real point about security is there can be a random act out there that happens, but largely where you go are your deliberate choices. And so if you do your research and your homework, you can choose to go where there is not this level of risk to you. And in the Caribbean right now, it's off Venezuela and it's off of Central America. There's a big area of active piracy.
Kind of the Honduras-Nicaragua border, and radiating out from there.
And other places in the Caribbean, it can be that dinghies disappear, outboards disappear, so there's less risk. And if you go there knowing that there's no personal risk, but that your outboard might disappear, then you're going to hoist it up every night and lock it up to make sure that doesn't happen to you. So again, big picture routing is making deliberate choices and doing that in an informed way. Legal consideration.
I'm sorry, I got to put in a little note about Salty Dog Sailing Association. Actually, one of the things that we think is really cool about the organization is that they are about deliberate choices and about informing you. And I swear I was not planning to do a plug or something, but I really value the fact that they emphasize it is a skipper's choice. When you set off, it's not about a shotgun start. It's about being knowledgeable, being prepared, and then making your own decision, making your deliberate choice.
No. Truer words are never spoken. Legal considerations. So if you're planning your season's cruising and you pick these countries you want to go and visit, the next level is to go in and see, can you visit them? Is there a visa requirement that you need to have in advance?
Of course, now, what are the COVID requirements?
What are the COVID requirements? Of course, this defines so much of everything.
Does it help if I have a vaccine, or doesn't it?
Or some countries you need to have a bond. Post a bond or have an agent to do
basically to post that bond.
Yeah. And so what are the legal considerations? Every year we hear about cruisers that show up somewhere, they didn't do homework, and they end up having to exit the country prematurely.
And sometimes it's very simple things with less serious ramifications than being pushed out, but showing up without clearance from your prior country, just not realizing that actually is a requirement for most countries. You need to demonstrate that you legally cleared out of the prior country, and that a normal amount of time has elapsed since you left there and you're arriving in this new place, so that they know nothing nefarious has occurred.
Right. Excellent. Another one, it's really important if you've not had, if you have little experience cruising or on passage making, is the pace of passages. life at 6 knots is really slow. And so it's easy before you've had this experience.
I miss life at 6 knots.
Oh, I do too. Yeah, life right now in an apartment in Mexico is really slow. But when you're planning your season and you want to go to all these places, it's not uncommon for people to plan perhaps a little bit more aggressively than they ought to, more distance covered, more islands visited, and then within 20% into the season, they're exhausted by it. They've always on the go. They're having to say goodbye to friends too quickly because they have this plan that they stick to. So be a little bit open to the idea that your plans are going to change, and maybe a slower pace is what you're really looking for. A lot of people want to get out of the rat race, and a slow pace is doing that. Okay, so that's a fairly simplistic part of route planning. Here's really the meat of it. It's this pre-passage planning. There's a lot of segments to it, and we'll step through them. Step one is make a route. So we're gonna, this is the more, not the season plan, but we're going from here to that island over there. And we're gonna start by making a route with 2 waypoints, a start waypoint and a destination waypoint.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Very simple, okay? Just like this. This is Mexico to Marquesas in French Polynesia. And then step 2 is to plan for everything else in between, which there's a whole bunch of this. So if we've got those initial 2 points, the first thing that we're going to do now is to zoom in. We have to zoom in because zoomed out, you can't see the detail that we need to, especially in a large area route. And I'm going to push the point of zooming in a number of times in this because there have been some tragedies around not doing that. But you can see here, getting to Hiva-Oa, the straight line path doesn't work very well. Next slide. So we add waypoints to get in. And what we're doing is we're putting effort up front to create a path that is a path that we can pilot on. We can stay on this line and know that we're not going to hit anything, barring a ship coming by. But that's what the watch is supposed to be keeping an eye out for. Okay, next one. But then we also have to call into question the chart's accuracy. Do we really know if you're mainly been boating in US or Canada or UK and places where the charting is very good, and you go to other parts of the world, perhaps the charting isn't as good. And so you should always call it into question. And there's different ways that you can do that. You can put out a request through a Facebook group about a region, a particular region like Bahamas, for example. You might even overlay satellite charts, satellite imagery onto charts that are geo-indexed, and to see how the charts line up. And we knew going into French Polynesia and many other places that the charts are quite inaccurate. So we're going to give those waypoints that we put in the route a lot of a margin for error, because there's clearly error in this. Okay. And then one I think it's important is if it's a longer trip, like the rally that goes from Norfolk down to Antigua, is to segment longer passages into different parts, because they're distinctly different parts. So for an example here, you might look like, hey, there's a straight line and that's the distance. But if you try that straight line, especially come November with the prevailing winds, it's probably not going to go very well. And so the first leg is about getting across the Gulf Stream and getting your easting in, making some easting. And it might be a consideration to route near to Bermuda. So if you've got a mechanical problem, a health issue, you get fatigued or something, you can bail out, take a rest.
Sort of built in.
Yep. And then what are the other segments? How do they break down? So there's this middle area, number 2, where it might be really light and variable conditions, but you're trying to get that easting in for number 3, where you're going across the trade winds, where the winds are going to be stronger. 18 to maybe 25 knots is easier to do when the wind is on the beam than when it's forward of the beam. So longer passages, maybe longer than 500 or so miles. Look at segmenting them based on the natural features.
Yeah,
the personality.
Kind of each phase has its own personality. I think of them like pregnancy trimesters. They have different features. Yeah, well, that's part of it. You forget about it as soon as the passage is over.
Did we mention zooming in? If not, okay, we did. But let's mention that again.
It bears repeating.
It bears repeating. This is the tragic example of having missed this point. This is off the coast of Mexico, just a little south of the U.S.-Mexico border. San Diego's just a little bit north of here. And
see San Diego Bay up there, and there's Tijuana.
Yep.
And the goal, I think, for this was probably getting down to Ensenada.
There was this kind of a race that went down, down the coast, Ensenada, and a boat, a bunch of boats did it, and this one particular boat, and they set their route, and I think it was 5 or 6 guys on the boat, and they had seen quite clearly on the chart the island there that's next to the smaller red circle, and maybe they were zoomed out more than this. This is my screenshot. What they didn't recognize or pick up on, because they didn't zoom in, is that little mess above the island is in fact another much smaller island, North Coronado, and that's the zoom in on the box there. And next slide. This was the boat and the guys at the start of the race, and they tragically sailed into that charted island, and they were all lost in the boat. And the boat was found because the spot tracker stopped making progress, and it took a couple days to figure it out. But the boat was so ground up in the surf, they only found small pieces of the boat. This is not the only time this has happened. It really is a terrible tragedy, and it's easily avoided by simply, once you get that safe route at a zoomed out level, zoom in from start to finish and make sure there's not some little anomaly in there that you can't see. Research. So we have this safe path that we can pilot. We know that if we stay on this line, that we're not going to hit anything, we're safe. But there's more to a route than that. Pre-passage planning. Okay. So we want to understand the destination a little better. What's going to be like when we get there?
So here's the choice destination. This is Saguaro Atoll in the Cook Islands, which is more or less smack in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
And you can see this atoll, there's a lot of water going in and out of an atoll. And on the inside of the atoll, there's coral. These are just the big coral heads. There's lots and lots and lots of little ones. And so getting into it, you have to know this going in. And we literally were using satellite imagery because there's no chart accuracy here to get a better sense of the safe path in. And knowing that ahead of time, if we arrived here and we felt like we were borderline fatigued, we probably would have stood off on the leeward side of the island and hove to and gotten rest before trying to go in with eyeball navigation into a very, very tricky anchorage like this. Going into a place like this when you're
fatigued or arriving without appropriate light. You want to have good light to be able to see every coral head in your path coming through that pass. And it could be that you'd stop as well because it's the wrong time of day in terms of the tide turnover. Is the water rushing in or out of the atoll? And what does that mean? I mean, you can have a standing wave across that narrow entrance.
And literally, when you're doing destination research, list out all the risks associated with your arrival there. And that way you've got familiarity with them before you get there and know when to pull back and say, look, now's not a good time. We're going to wait a little bit before going in. Okay, this security concerns again. So we looked at it on the big level. Now we're looking at individual regional levels. This is when we were in the bottom of the Malay Peninsula near Singapore.
We were over here at the bottom left of the screen there at the Petrie Harbor Marina.
And we had this big plan to go back up the top of Borneo and then up to the Philippines. And while we're preparing for this and waiting, and we were dealing with some engine issues at the time, out of the blue, this cruising boat, a big Amel, turned up drifting with no people on it. And nobody knew what happened to it. There was speculation that they were swimming and
taken by crocodiles.
There was also speculation that
plausible, actually, up there.
Yeah, very plausible. There was also speculation that it was this extremist group that happens to live in the region and
usually more Sulu Sea area over here as opposed to towards Puerto Princesa, towards the south.
But they were escalating what their actions were, and they had never taken a cruising boat or anything like it before. But this popped up on the radar, and we could have just ignored it as a random thing. But we watched it. We kind of wanted to know what happened before we started actually heading that way. And it did turn out after a little while that they were picked up by that extremist group and held captive, ransom, and they were killed.
They were killed, as were people twice later within that subsequent seasons were also taken and ransomed and murdered. So it was something that, in our case, we were making a very conservative choice. It seemed perhaps extremely conservative by choosing not to go based on a single report. But it was the bellwether of a change in the range and the tone and the actions that were being taken by this group, which put it off the record for us, or off the map for us. Now, we would go at this time with more information and route differently based upon what we feel is a safe path, where we would stop and where we would simply pass through.
Yeah. More commonly, security issues range around outboards disappearing or petty theft off of a boat. And for that, you want to, before you go to a region, look at what are the resources to help us figure out what's there. And it can be the so-called coconut telegraph of using Facebook and other cruising groups that are out there to report that stuff. Or the Caribbean Safety and Security Net is an excellent one.
Mm-hmm. I've used Moonsight as well, kind of before regional cruising Facebook groups took off, looking at who had made recent reports to Moonsight on a given region, and then contacting those people directly and asking them for it was a way of jumping the coconut telegraph into an area outside of what your immediate circle might have been, and a great way to get local information.
So, route research. Sometimes it may look pretty simplistic to go from A to B, and a big route like this, Ascension to Barbados, that we did. There were effectively no hazards. There was one island we were going to pass by, and we actually went a little out of the way to go closer to it just to see it.
Oh, it's beautiful. Just like not just in the canal.
De Naranja.
Yeah.
Eso de Naranja.
And it was so alluring, so tempting, but just to stop was a costly proposition.
Yeah.
But there was another cruising boat passing at the same time. We were able to wave and carry on in separate directions.
But in doing research for this particular route, this is our longest passage, 3,300 nautical miles. We referred to Cornell's book as an excellent resource. And one interesting note was it said you have to cross the equator by this point where the arrow is, because if you get further west than that to trade winds, the angle of them won't allow you to make it to the Caribbean. You'll end up somewhere in South America. And so I started then studying the wind patterns just to make sure. And at the same time, I happened to be reading Slocum's Sailing Around the World. And he talked about this Brazil current. And I then went and looked at Gribbs and found that, wow, there's this 3 knots of current. And wouldn't that be great to get into? And it looked like the trades angles were okay. We were going to make it. So the other boats that we had been in the season crossing from South Africa across to the Caribbean with all did what Cornell prescribed. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I found that by looking at the real patterns of now, not what was averaged out over 100 years, and looking at other resources like Slocum, I found that it was worth taking this scenic route. It turned out to be a much faster track. We did 242 nautical miles as our best day. We did that trip in 17 days, where the other boats were often in 25 days and running out of wind to the point where they were running out of diesel fuel. So do your route research and figure out what variables may mean that you don't want to do the shortest path. Maybe you're getting off one direction or another to get better wind or into a current or less volatile weather, like in an ITCZ crossing. When you're routing, pre-passage routing, you want to have your bailout options when at all possible, because sometimes, despite the great planning, a passage may not go as you expected. This is an example. We're in the Western Pacific. We were in Vanuatu and Port Vila, looking to go to New Caledonia, and it was a pretty straight shot down with a pass through the Loyalty Islands. And when we got underway, the wind had shifted to be much more south than east-southeast or southeast even. And it made it
a bit of a bash. Really.
It was a total bash. And friends of ours a couple of days ahead of us ended up being dismasted in the trip. And partway down, we realized that this is pretty aggressive conditions. and tough on the boat being so far forward of the wind. So we ended up pulling out into one of our bailout options in this little island in the loyalty group called Lifu. And in the picture of the inset was one of the boat that was with us, and we pulled in. It was a beautiful, stunning stop.
It's a little hard to tell from this picture, but if you can imagine that the cliff side of this island is like a geode that's been sawed in half, and these caves are full of stalactites, stalagmites. It's kind of sparkly in there. It was quite spectacular.
And very sharky snorkeling.
Yeah, we didn't end up spending much time in the water. Very sharky.
We're comfortable with sharks, but these were.
There are times when you know just to get back out again.
Yeah.
That was one.
but do route with bailout options, and it may mean in places that your route doesn't just identify them, but you may route to sort of slant a little bit closer to them, much like airplanes are routed for commercial airline, where they angle in ways to go near to airports. So if they have a bailout, then they've got one in the path. Bailout option is very important. Notice the mariners and other level of research, looking at if you're doing a route, look at AIS, what's available and propagated on internet websites to see all the shipping traffic that's out there. Is there a line that maybe you didn't think of as a common shipping lane, but it turns out is active out there? There's a good example right now, crossing to the Berry Islands in the Bahamas. They have for the last month been 20 to 25 cruise ships furloughed in that path. And so routing a few boats recently, I checked AIS, and there are all these 1,200-foot long cruise ships sitting there. And so they're pretty well lit up, but it's good to know ahead of time that you have these floating cities in the way you got to meander around. Weather buoys and oceanographic buoys that are out there. If you're out in the deep ocean, they do exist out there, and they're it's a needle in a haystack.
Right, it's the proverbial needle in a haystack. But boy, boats do actually see those pins
and
those needles.
And they do tend to follow a grid system. So you may look them up and make sure you're not on that line of latitude or longitude. And then another one, is there wreckage or debris or things like that? And that one's uncommon, but it's not unheard of. This is a boat in the Seychelles that it's a charter boat that sank when we were there. We happened to come on it. When we were rounding South Africa, there was a boat that had been lost the year before that was identified some months before as drifting roughly out in the path we're going to be in, unfortunately a little bit further out. And another one when we're in the Pacific going to the Cook Islands, to Tonga actually. Yeah, a catamaran had flipped over there. And so do be aware of these other hazards out there. Question? No.
Nope.
Okay. Weather considerations. This doesn't mean the literal weather window, but what are the variables that are features of this particular route? For example, the Gulf Stream or the Agulhas Current around South Africa. Or maybe it's an area with strong katabatic winds in one time of year. Often regions have this characteristic that can be really prominent and surprising if you hadn't figured it out beforehand. And dig in a little bit to understand it better. A lot of times people perceive the Gulf Stream as this sort of channel of water that's moving quickly with hot water in it. And that's partly true until you get to the east side of the Gulf Stream. And then it's this maze of eddies and meanders and filaments that are going all number of different directions. And if you've got wind that's pushing you along beautifully and you run into an eddy that's coming with a knot and a half, 2 knots of current against you, it's going to get uncomfortable very quickly. So if that's a feature, then you can know that you might want to try to get current information before you go, and if at all possible, when you're en route, if you've got satellite communications, it's a lot of data, but if you really zoom into your geographic area, you can usually get to, say, a 60 square mile area, and that's enough for a 12-hour period.
So for example, actually, we were talking about this a little bit just actually ahead of the seminar today. It's so common for us to think of currents as these monolithic forces, right? As these rivers in the ocean, when they are actually, as Jamie was saying, so complex with meanders and eddies and filaments, and really bears trying to figure out how to pay attention to that from offshore, which is going to be a function of your offshore communications and the weather tools you use and how they're able to pull that data. When we were sailing from Madagascar to South Africa, which is another current described in monolithic terms, the Agulhas current, kind of like the Gulf Stream, but yet is not monolithic. It is so complicated and really moves around and changes the location. We were pulling grids for current with every update that we got, or with every update available, and making a route changes underway in order to minimize discomfort and maximize opportunity of getting to our B destination before the next weather system rolled up from the South Atlantic.
Another example, right? And another example of this wind related is in Mexico in the summertime. There are these events called chubascos. And what they are, massive thunderstorms that form over the hot air mainland in the summer. The heat creates this tremendous heat. There's evaporation. There's all this energy in the atmosphere, and then it blows west with prevailing winds. And most people tend to be on the Baja side. And around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, or if you're on passage underway, whether you're underway at anchor, this thing can come across. Most of the time, they don't make it all the way across, but once in a while they do. And it can be 50 knots plus wind, lightning, a lot of violence and volatility in these things. And if you're naive to this fact, you can have a terrible surprise. And that seems to happen every year. People haven't heard about them. So these weather considerations on the route that we're kind of honing in on and building our knowledge base around it.
In the past too, then, because weather data wasn't as good, it would affect the anchorages you would choose on the Baja side of the Sea of Cortez, which side of islands you would go to and what kind of protection you'd look for. And now we have this awesome, actually improved access to information about what's forming on those mainland mountains and can decide to stay in what in the past would have been an exposed anchorage, but maybe a cool spot we want to explore, and know that we can stay or leave based upon what the forecast is looking like with quite a bit of confidence. So it's amazing actually how even just in the 10 years that elapsed between leaving Mexico and coming back to Mexico, how much available weather data has changed to allow us to make safe decisions and explore further.
And if your anchor starts dragging, you're on passage.
That's right.
All right, this is one I think is really important, passage or delivery. And what I mean by this is that you've figured out your route, you've done your safety checks, you've looked at weather. Is this trip going to be a leisure event? Like, okay, the wind's going to be variable, but we're not in a rush, so it's okay. We'll go slow. Or is this one where you're in this weather window that's pretty well bookended by bigger weather, bigger events coming, more volatility, and you want to get to destination with a buffer time in advance of that next event? And that means when the wind goes light, the engine goes on to keep that buffer of time there, because if you end up with a mechanical issue or some other issue that slows you down later, you run late and it gets a lot more complicated. We had this going to South Africa, and the system was coming. We knew it was coming. We thought we had 9 to 12 hours of buffer. It came early. It came 17 miles early, or 17 miles from destination. Mm-hmm. By 7 miles, we were in this horrible sea state and big wind. Mm-hmm. It took us 3 hours to go 1.5 miles, turned the corner and got into Richards Bay, and it was a tremendous relief.
Tremendous,
but
yes.
Passage or delivery, this is like about getting to destination in this fixed time, or this is just an enjoyable thing? Moon phase, I find that particularly when you've got, when you're newer to passage making and sailing at night, to go with a big moon and having that ambient light is very helpful, so that
it's amazing what you can see once you're away from light pollution on land, and your eyes have adjusted to the dark night. That the moon really lets you see what the sea state is doing instead of having those waves sneak up and surprise you, which can be pretty disturbing when in a black night.
Huge. You can trim your sails by moonlight when it's that light out, and so early passage making, if you have the chance to make it happen when it's a bigger moon, then I think there's some benefit to that. Okay, step 4, weather window. So we're getting close to actually making passage here, and we're looking at actual weather. When is it go time? When is it not go time? And I can't stress this point enough. Weather defines the whole passage. And you are the forecaster. Everything else is just a tool. And this is literal. This is, you can get information from a weather router, you can get information from GRIBs, from text weather, from weather radar, from satellite imagery. All of those things still are just tools that you're building your forecast for. And when you go, you have to do it based on the forecast that you feel is right for your crew and for your boat. There's a whole lot to weather, and unfortunately, that's a different topic we're not getting into. But just a couple minor points. When you're going to go on passage, study weather patterns in advance. The longer the passage is, the longer in advance you should be looking at those patterns. And if you don't see patterns, you're not looking enough. They're usually pretty commonly patterns to, so let's say November and the Salty Dog Rally is getting ready to go, early November, you should be watching for probably a month in advance of that. And you'll see an increase in the frequency of gales that come. You'll see a decrease in the frequency in named storms that are coming up out of the southeast and across the higher or hotter climates. And you're looking for these patterns. And then when it comes go time, you get a nice weather window. How well does it fit these patterns that you were seeing? Really important to pick up on this, not just wind, but also those watch the current patterns as well and sea state. Tweak for efficiency, so sailing efficiency. So it may be that you're going from place A to B, there's no hazards in the way, there's nothing to watch out for, there's no shipping lane, it's just as simple as you get.
Rumline, right?
Rumline sailing, yeah, perfect, until you get out into this ginormous hole and you realize you're gonna run out of diesel before you get to destination. In fact, this trip from Chagos in the Indian Ocean to the Seychelles.
So if we zoomed out here, what you're looking at is actually more or less the western half of the Indian Ocean, and starting right around the equator is just a little bit above that that green pin there. Chagos is pretty close to the middle. It's just a little south of the equator in the Indian Ocean.
And when we were in the Indian Ocean, there were a group of boats out crossing as well, and several of them left, and they didn't get the memo that you need to drop south to get back into the wind, into the prevailing trade winds, and they remained along the equator too long. I think one boat was out 25 or 26 days, ran out of fuel, got fuel delivery from a tanker so they could get to destination, because otherwise they weren't going anywhere. And the other boat was over 20 days slatting around and beating up sails, tough on it. And they got there, and full credit to them for sticking it out. We did that in 7 days. So there's a big difference. And even if you love passages, 20 days of baking your brains out on the equator is just not fun for anybody.
We still have jerry cans from that boat that took them lowered over from the tanker.
From the tanker.
Actually, they ended up with a bunch of extra jerry cans, and we've got 2 of those as our spare diesel jerry on Totem. Yeah, they're not the kind of thing you buy off the shelf at West Marine, let's just say.
So you're looking at weather, and maybe you're not comfortable. I think a great option is to look at a weather router. And I know Chris Parker does a lot of great work for the Salty Dog organization, and he's a great resource. He's very skilled. This is not Chris Parker, but this is another router that I got off the internet. I just poached it. Yes, I did. But anyway, if you're not experienced in offshore weather or the weather in the area you're going to go, a little bit of cost for this is a great peace of mind and probably a lot more comfortable passage making and even being anchored. You can get weather information coming up for an area of disturbed weather, and you know that, okay, we can't stay here, it's not going to be good. Another option that's gotten increasingly better is weather routing software. And this used to be a feature for racing boats, for racing offshore. And in the last several years, it's become a more common feature for cruising boats. And PredictWind is by far and away the one that's put the biggest effort into it. We've been using them for a number of years. They've just come out with a new update in their routing software. And there are definitely some tricks to using it well, another topic that we cover. But this is a great resource. Even if you're going to have a weather router, to start looking and using what does the software
Yeah.
think the route
Use that to
that's the
learn.
best.
Use that as a way of practicing and trying to figure it out for yourself, and then listening to expert advice until they're aligning well enough and you realize that you're actually kind of on the ball with it. Because we feel like it's just exceptionally important, because these early bad experiences by misreading the weather forecast, misinterpreting the reasons why the software says certain things and making assumptions on them, this is what typically get new cruisers into uncomfortable or even scary and dangerous situations, and end up stopping cruising dreams too soon.
Prematurely,
Yeah, especially if there is someone on board who's not fully on board. They're going along for the ride, but the ride needed to be a little more comfortable. It's an unfortunate way that cruising dreams end too soon.
Yeah.
So we really think it's a great idea to have a professional weather router, someone who knows your boat and your situation. While it's awesome to have the resources of a router through something like the Salty Dogs rallies, you have to also keep in mind that they are providing guidance for a fleet, and every boat has different speeds, different pace, different comfort levels, different responses to various sea states, and really having something that's tailored to you can be fairly priceless if it means that you get to the other side and everyone's really glad that you're there.
But weather is something you can never learn enough of. I've gotten to do a lot of weather routing for people in the last several years, and I start with weather routing software because it helps shortcut me to what I end up with as the best route. I often tweak what it shows me, but it's a great resource. So maybe start looking at that as a tool in the toolbox of weather that you have. Herd mentality. And groupthink. This is not uncommon, especially with newer cruisers that are feeling a little bit less certain about weather choices, to be in a group on the dock and you're not sure, and somebody down the dock's like, well, I'm going next Tuesday because I think it looks good enough. And you're like, okay, well, yeah, next Tuesday, so it looks good to me too. I think it's okay. And falling into what the herd is doing and maybe not being comfortable with it. When you leave the harbor, the marina, the anchorage, you have to do it because you want to be going out. You feel it's good enough. And again, if you're not sure, you don't know who the dude down the dock is with the gray beard is given all this great weather information, maybe he's not quite as knowledgeable, go to the weather router or pause and dig into the weather a little bit deeper. Unscheduled. Schedules get people into trouble. Probably among the biggest causes of getting out into bad weather is that so-and-so is flying to the island to meet them, or there's a crew on and they can only be here until a week from now. And so we only get one more day of waiting and then we have to get going. These are the things that don't work well on a boat. If you've got crew or family meeting you somewhere, we often say you get to pick the time or the place, but not both. Because if the weather's not right, you shouldn't be going just because of other constraints. And this is what it really all comes down to, is the consequences of wrong. If it ends up badly, it can be tragic. This is a cat that was off the West Coast being delivered up to the Pacific Northwest with a professional crew. They were on a schedule. They had been out in lots of tough stuff. It turned out the coast was tougher than they were, and they were never found again. So when you're out there, if you've not been out and been scared or been out in uncomfortable conditions, and really recognize how precarious it feels to know that, okay, I can't push the stop button. We can't just pull over and get out at the truck stop. So make choices wisely. Final prep. Float plan. We strongly encourage everyone to file a float plan with your boat's information so that you can be identified very quickly. Mostly it's for family and a lot of peace of mind. And but it's an important step. Don't shortcut it. It's got real value. Crew meeting. This is really important, especially if that little one on the far side is not paying attention. You gotta pinch them a little to get their attention. But even kids, everybody in the boat should have an idea of what the route plan is, what the expectation is, where are we going, what are the things that we have to pay special attention to and precaution. What's the weather going to be like? What are the safety procedures we're going to have on the boat. Make sure everybody's on board with this, because they're invested in this as much as the captain is, and it's helpful if they know from the beginning. Okay, routing underway. Just a couple of points here. This is a proven anti-fatigue technique. Sleep.
This is your enemy. Fatigue is your enemy.
Fatigue makes for bad decisions, and there's a real huge difference between being a bit tired and actual fatigue. And if you've not been offshore much, a 24-hour passage overnight, you'd be pretty tired by the next morning, but you're not likely to be fatigued. If you're into a 48-hour passage, you can be fatigued going into that second night if you've not been getting the sleep that you need. So sleep is huge, even if it's in 10-minute increments or whatever it's necessary, you have to get sleep. Adapting to minor changes. I know we're pushing the time here, so I won't get into this, but basically when you're underway on a passage and you're getting weather updates during the day, and you're maybe on one path like that blue line and the wind is a certain direction. In this case, I was routing a boat to French Polynesia, and I saw that in a couple of days, there's going to be a wind shift from east to be more southeast. And so in advance of that wind shift, I had them angle more to the south. That's that dive south comment, to get further south so that when the shift of the wind was further south, then they could angle back to the destination and have the wind still in a good direction. If they stayed on the original course, the wind probably with the apparent wind angle would have gone forward of the beam. And when waves are coming at you, they hurt. They're less comfortable. There's a lot more motion. So little minor changes can make a big difference.
And one of those things that sounds not terrible in theory when you're planning from a comfortable chair, but really can be quite miserable when you're actually up.
And you'll go faster too by setting up for a better wind angle. Adapting to big changes. This is our passage from Australia up to Papua New Guinea. And
green was the intention.
That was our intended track, the green line east of the Louisiana archipelago, and we were going to then go west with the trade winds. And in this big green circle, we had nice conditions, but then the weather started to change. We had a high pressure and a low pressure merged together, and we were in a squash zone in the middle in that yellow area. And our track started to waver a little bit. And then by the red area, we were 8 o'clock at night, and we came up a wave, all beam on conditions, and we slid sideways down the wave, big waves.
No bueno.
35 to 50 knot winds.
Not good.
And sliding sideways in a wave means you're not steering anymore, the wave's steering you. And so I said to Behan, one more wave like that, we're going somewhere else.
And you can guess what happened. We had one more wave like that and changed course.
Yep. And Behan said, and I was like, okay, what do we want to do? We've got the Great Barrier Reef over here, turning around is tough. So Behan said, what about if we just go to the western end of the archipelago? And literally that like 10 or 15 degree angle change was all it took to regain steerage and control. We never had another event on the passage where we didn't have steerage. And so it can be a minor change. When you've got big weather, it can feel scary, but it doesn't mean you need to jump into a para anchor or drogue and big things like that. Those are tough to manage and deal with. So
this is part of that research that you do before you go too about bailouts, having A, B, C, and D kind of plans for where you might actually end up. So we had looked into this, and the downside of it for us really, and the challenges, it can be mentally difficult to give up on your plan. And we had kind of a capital P plan for this. We were really excited. I was especially excited about starting at the eastern end of the archipelago and working our way west, because that was the way the winds were going. And this meant we weren't going to see those islands that I'd literally been studying about in college and had massively anticipated. But when you're faced with staying safe, it's really the only reasonable option.
it was a quick choice. We had a good rest of passage, although lively, and this is our gateway into being on another planet and another time. Really, very importantly, daylight arrival. There are very, very, very few exceptions to this, and they include like a giant open bay with very
gradual, shallowing depths,
and no obstacles, no lobster
surprises.
traps and things like that. Otherwise, if you recognize in your ETA arrival planning time, it looks like you're going to arrive early or late and it's going to be dark, slow down, speed up, do whatever to tweak that time in advance, so then you don't arrive in the middle of the night and then have to stand off in the dark when you're really tired and want to just go to sleep. Or kind of say, let me just sneak up and try and get in and misread a buoy, a channel, get a lobster pot wrapped around the prop, and then you're stuck. Those stories happen, so daylight arrival. Okay, and then a really important part of route planning is the post-mortem. What happened after you did this route? You did the passage, you get there, sit down after your wits are about it, you've gotten rested, you've had a beer or whatever, a couple days later, and just kind of review what your plan was and what actually happened. What are the takeaways? What did you learn from it that you can do better the next time? Or what did you do really well to make note of for next time so that you do that again? The postmortem, or a debriefing, it's sometimes called, is a super important part of this. And it's not like, oh yeah, maybe just a quick chat. Literally, this is a step in the whole process to getting to be a better offshore cruiser. And that's it. Right on time, 2 o'clock.
Hey, all right, 2 o'clock.
Well,
We hope that's been helpful. We'd love to be able to field questions. If anyone would like to talk about their particular passage and how it might have been addressed, we're here.
well, thank you very much. Yeah, if anyone has some questions, please put them into the chat. I really relate to your plan A, B, and C, having just did
Lived
one of
it.
those. Yeah,
Yeah.
where plan A was the Chesapeake via Bermuda, that didn't work. And then plan B was New York. And then plan C was, well, why bother? Since we're going right by Newport, let's just go in there. So
That's a
and-
perfect example.
yeah, and those decisions obviously were not made a day and before we got there. I mean, those were decisions made over like a 3-week period. So I think that's really relevant. And I also liked your point about postmortems. I know we're due to have one, particularly with our weather router, because we're not convinced that we didn't feel really well prepared with our Gulfstream experience, which was not terrible, as I mentioned to you.
Mhm.
Ours was just more current than we expected.
Yeah.
And we had a really solid plan, and it kind of threw some monkey wrenches in, but in the end it was all fine. So I think it's great
Yeah, that's
stuff.
a really good point, though, and you put it in the chat, and I want to bring it up for folks that didn't see it, which is that you said current data, downloading that to the boat when you're underway can really eat up your bandwidth. So making sure that you're selecting a very small area to get just the information you need and not download extraneous data that you can't actually use in order to do that. That is so important, in understanding how to do that before you go.
Yeah, it's a whole different discussion and class on grid, using grid models. And I think I did one for Salty Dog, but one of the details to the current information is that there are 3 or 4 models for current that exist out there. And one of them that's pretty common is RTOFS. And RTOFS has a huge data demand, even with a small area. But there's another one called HICOM, which is based on, it's a derivative of the RTOFS model. And it takes maybe 10% of the data. So if you want to get current offshore, it's that one that you might look at. If you're trying to get RTOFS, even the small area will work.
Yeah, we also tried downloading. I was sent a picture of the kind of the Gulfstream, which we eventually got, but I mean, maybe I didn't do enough tuning. Well, I eventually tuned my Iridium to get the file. It was a beautiful piece of art once we got it, but it was very, very, very frustrating to get it.
Yeah, no, we understand that. There's definitely some tweaks using Iridium Go and other satellite communications to get the most out of them, or to be mind-numbingly slow.
And it's time consuming to do the practicing on those, because you can't practice on a normal internet bandwidth connection where you don't feel that pain and don't realize the tuning that has to take place. And so for crews that are especially busy getting ready, counting down to departure, it's very easy to skip that step because you know how to do it, except that you haven't really trialed it in the scenarios. And until you feel that pain, it's it's hard to appreciate.
It's also, if you're a shorthanded crew, it's distracting. If your effort is like, we really got to get this down, and it takes you a few hours of distraction trying to make that happen, are you paying attention to squalls and other weather and other things out there at the same time?
Yeah, I think we were fortunate that, I mean, I did mine on the off watch. I spent hours on the off watch doing that. But it sorted itself out in the end. So we were pretty happy with the results. So great. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Nothing, no question is.
I don't know if anyone has a
Yeah.
passage or a big picture route in mind and they want to use that as an example, we can talk to it. That's
Okay.
scary.
Well, I suspect, everyone's still planning their passages, but I think one last point that I really like that you made is, you've got one. In our case, we actually had multiple weather routers. I had the one that my captain had selected, and then when things were turning a little pear-shaped, I reached out to US-based folks, and they referred me to someone and who was even more familiar. They were out of Newport, so they kind of knew exactly the mess we were in. So I guess my message to folks is, don't be afraid to use multiple resources, and your kind of reference to shore-based support. Get lots of emails with lots of interesting commentary on why are you doing what you're doing. But I think it all really helps that's what makes it a great experience. Oh,
Yeah.
we think we may have one. Here we go.
There's a bunch of stuff popping up here. Let's take
I guess
it.
if I talk long enough, we'll get someone to say something.
So these are great, actually. These are awesome. Contouring depth on certain passages. Contouring depth is definitely a feature to keep in mind in different areas. And I'm trying to think, maybe North America, East Coast, West Coast, there's like some different concerns there. Massive continental shelf on the East Coast, and how folks take that into consideration, perhaps.
Sure, and they define the currents really. So the Gulf Stream follows the deep side of the continental shelf up the coast, and that's a factor. You can also have currents that run into from deep ocean into the shelf, and it can create this sort of popcorny wash in the water that has an impact. But I think that
I speculate that was part of the setup for the rogue waves we encountered south of Papua New Guinea, which that's the only time it's happened, thank God. But basically, going from thousands of feet to some hundreds, a very massive change in depth can create sea states
at the end of a gale.
Yeah, well, compounding factors for sure. And for some folks, it's a rationale to choose routing further offshore to be in what might feel like a more stable area. That's a philosophical choice as well.
There's a lot to big depth changes and what it does to the water. So know if you're going over big contour, do study the current, do study the wave pattern, and have an expectation of what might happen when you get there.
So about 10 days ago, there was a Salty Dog seminar by Kevin Ferry, who's the Fear Not Fishing guy. And I think we need to mention that Kevin would insist on routing by depth contours on your passages so that you can maximize your fishing opportunity.
And warm water, as I learned.
Yes.
I'm going to go from the bottom back. There was one question that was asked. You spoke a lot about researching the routes. What resources would you suggest?
Well, it can be staples like Jimmy Cornell's World Cruising Routes. That's a common initial go-to.
I'm a fan of primary data, and Jamie talked about that a bunch. Just studying patterns. So, for example, every day, after the afternoon grid update or something, maybe pull that down and take a look at it, and look at it every day for some weeks in anticipation of a passage that you're planning in the future, or just as a hypothetical exercise. And look at what changes. Look at a really great example is timing around boats headed to the Caribbean. So look in October and November of a given year, and maybe keep count on a whiteboard of tropical storms that are fading out and gales that are coming in, and look at the count and the dates over time, just to sort of get yourself in tune with the rhythm from a primary data basis. And then if you want to look at them aggregated, of course, there's pilot charts.
Yeah, and the difference here is one set of sources is documented. They're helpful base resources like Cornell, like pilot charts. They're an important part of this, but it is also maybe stale data. That's why going to look at the real patterns that are happening now, or reach out in a regional Facebook group to somebody's there and say, hey, what are you guys seeing out there? What was your path there? Cruisers like to share information, and the information shared is maybe not always the best, but it is a source of information and it might be helpful.
I mentioned Moonsight as well. I really like Moonsight as a big picture place for a whole lot of information that's useful for cruisers, whether it's about clearing in formalities data, whether it's about experiences and security people have had. We know that they put a lot of effort into keeping that current, because for Mexico, for example, they'll ping us. The editor knows we're in Mexico. We spent a lot of time in Mexico. And so we're a good source for them to query and just say, hey, does what we have up here look accurate with the current situation there? Can you kind of give that a thumbs up? And that's really priceless. It sort of takes the Coconut Telegraph and it turns it into this great global resource. And related to a little bit to that, some of the resources then that you can find through there. So for security, we showed a few security resources and screenshots, but didn't quite address them specifically as much. A great one for the Caribbean is CSSN, Caribbean Safety and Security Net. And CSSN is a website. They've also got, I think, a Facebook group and a page, so you can connect back to that. But they track reports of security incidents around the Caribbean, and it's a great way to figure out not just what's going on and where, but if it's changing over time, what it's like from season to season, and also the severity of it. So that paints a really clear picture of stay away from the Honduras and Nicaragua border and those flats off of it, but use common sense in places with petty theft, maybe in the Eastern Caribbean chain, as opposed to just stay away.
I think one other good one to mention are cruising guides. They can be great resources. So Bahamas have the Explorer charts, which will lay out safe paths from A to B, because they've done that. They've taken that data, they put it in, they go around the shoals, and they help shortcut you to safe paths. But other regions, like there's one in Sea of Cortez here in Mexico, and it talks about those chubascos that I mentioned earlier, the big wind events that happen. So you get more than just, okay, you come in and then you turn to the east and you come in and anchor in 40 feet of water. They can give some insight into local knowledge that's going to make your experience better.
Mm-hmm.
There was one other question. There's a Corey's planning on going from Rockland to Annapolis outside of Cape Cod, as opposed to through the canal. Any thoughts on that?
What time of year is this?
That'll be probably in August is my guess.
August. Okay, so probably generally lighter conditions, but variable. I think you want to make sure there's not a big low pressure system up in the Canadian Maritimes that's going to have a big impact. And obviously not a named storm to the south that's going to push out big waves that are going to, make the crew seasick. And then outside, you've got a lot of current movement around Cape Cod and around the stretch of water from the end of Long Island up to Cape Cod. And so
this area in here, which is just, it can be a bit gnarly to navigate too, just in terms of various hazards, again, not to mention shipping.
A lot of fishing boats there. We have cruising friends that were off the coast of New Jersey and ended up lots of miscommunication and colliding with the fishing boat. Their boat was a total loss because of it. So that's a hazard to know in that path. If you're going to route more coastally around along the bottom of Long Island, as you get into that nook between Long Island and New Jersey, the New Jersey coast tends to surprise people often. And I don't quite understand the dynamic there, but I know a lot of people that have been whacked off of the New Jersey coast.
I'm going to speculate. I think that part of it is that it is often sailors that haven't got a lot of overnight passage experience. And for many cruising boats, because of our size, because of our draft, it can be difficult to stop in New Jersey. It kind of forces an overnight passage. And for someone who's not quite comfortable with the routines and the rhythms of that, it's more likely to get them into trouble or perhaps put them in a situation where fatigue pushes them to make that decision.
Yeah, it could be a beautiful passage though. I've done it from Maine down. And if you pick the right weather, and then you're just aware of these other little speed bumps along the way so that you're alert during watch, it can be a beautiful trip.
Kevin here says, and fishing boats don't always have AIS on.
Correct.
So true, right? And especially because it's, not necessarily commercial boats too, and can be a real problem.
AIS is a terrific tool, but it's not the only tool to identify boats out there. So if you've got radar, what we tend to do at night is to have ours on for a couple of minutes, stare at it, see what out there, any targets, and then turn it off to standby mode, not off altogether, but standby mode, and turn it back on again every 15 or so minutes. And in between, get your eyes used to that darkness again so you're paying attention. You might do this trip because it's a busy coastline when the moon is bigger as well.
I think the challenge for our participant coming from Maine down to Annapolis too is routing versus the Gulf Stream, and that it's going to be a longer path in some ways than in order to stay outside of it versus, although it kind of peels off below there.
It peels off.
But they'll have to pay attention to that as well.
They will. There is just a lot of water movement up in that part of the
and someone else is headed from the Chesapeake to Newport via New York City in about a week and a half here, and probably day hopping. So heading north from the Chesapeake and day hopping, that definitely helps as far as ameliorating what we were just talking about with the New Jersey coast and getting more comfortable with it and more familiar with it. Coming up north from the Chesapeake, you get to start going through the C&D Canal, which is a motorboat ride, really. You're just sort of, you drive through it. You're allowed to have a sail up and motor sail, but you're not allowed to sail through there. And it's a pretty ride. And then you get to the top in that Chesapeake or Delaware Bay there, the current rules all, and you almost plan your trip there based around what the current's doing, because it's just not worth bucking.
Yeah, if you do that route through C&D Canal and down the Delaware Bay, at the mouth of the Delaware Bay, you probably want to go with the shipping lanes out, because there may be depth on the charts, but there's a lot of shoaling and shifting based on big weather that happens on the bottom there. And it takes reading the water well to know how to stay out of a spot that's too shallow, no matter what the chart says. You might go up to Atlantic City and pause there.
That's the anchor. So we're screen sharing our open CPN chart here, and that's the anchor you can see off of New Jersey where we pulled in on Totem. So much current to anchor there.
Yeah, and then up by Sandy Hook and wait there. If you do go through New York City and south of Manhattan, it's a terrific experience. But do note that there's a lot of busyness, and
it's kind of terrifying, actually.
New York Harbor can be very, very choppy.
Exciting, but a little bit terrifying. I remember leaving, we were anchored off of what I think may go down as my favorite East Coast anchorage ever, off of Liberty Island, and to have sunset reflecting off of South Manhattan while Lady Liberty's lights come up. It's like unbelievable. But we left in the morning in the dark because that was the timing that we needed to arrive at our destination with the right light and the right conditions. And going through Manhattan Harbor in the dark with all of the noise of lights that make it very difficult to see the very legal navigation lights, which are bright enough officially, but which are still lost in the clutter of all of the light that's behind them on shore. It's really challenging, really, really challenging.
Yeah, the East River and then Hell's Gate is a whole class in and of itself. Very doable, but you have to know what you're doing going ahead. If you've got questions and you want to email us, that's fine. Long Island Sound is great gunk holing, lots and lots of little nooks there. There's also lots and lots of rocks, so you have to pay attention there pretty well. But
zooming out for a sec too, just to talk about the question in a bigger picture way, since it's a kind of a big picture routing seminar. When you're looking at this, I think of it first. You've got you're going to estimate about how many miles you're going to be able to do per day as you go, because you'll know what you can do on your boat in ideal conditions. And then you're going to look at what you're facing in terms of, I can only enter or leave at certain times from the ICW or whatever it is of day during this time. So I need to plan on that and then look at how many miles I do and literally map out what that whole transit looks like day by day, where you expect you're going to be. On a day by day basis, you'll then look at what are my A, B, C, and D bailout plans. But have a sense of the big picture of what that looks like. You can always recalibrate it and stop along the way and change it. And then as you do that, what I do on a day-to-day basis, I found really helpful when we're doing this coastal navigating, is to make a list of all of the hazards that we know about that we're going to face that day, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a shallow area, whether it's an area that has overfalls that we want to anticipate. And I have that list present, and like in the ICW, I literally had a yellow legal pad. But I like to keep it digitally, and so I would drop waypoints with notes on them along our route along the way as well. Active Captain, actually, back on the resource list, is another really good one, really kind of just for North America, but so helpful to be able to see crowdsourced information, apply the crowdsource filter to the quality of the data, but still a great place to get recent local knowledge. And then have all that ready. So before you leave in the morning, you're like, right, we're going to sit down, we're going to review. These are the things we're going to deal with today. And just having that, so that nothing is going to sneak up on you, I guess. We can all read a chart, hopefully. And so when you approach that bridge, you're going to be able to figure out what to do with that bridge. But if you've actually thought about it, written it out ahead of time, or made a note of it ahead of time, it's a lot easier, it's a lot less stressful, especially for a newer crew.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we had some great questions here towards the end, and your information is really, really useful. I think we all got a lot going on this summer that I think we can apply to this too, as well as in the fall. And once again, great. And I guess, feel free to reach out to Behan and Jamie if you have any other questions. Barb, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, Alex. Thank you so much, Behan and Jamie. As always, wonderful information that you've shared today. Appreciate your support of Salty Dogs.
Truly our pleasure, Barbara.
Thanks, Bob.
Always happy to help.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and end the Zoom meeting, and I'm sure we'll be seeing Behan and Jamie in the future, and hopefully we'll be seeing all of you next week for our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.